This is Joshua Part 2, a quick walk through the book. We'll look at it unit by unit. Chapter 1 includes the foundational charter for Joshua, and it establishes the book as, in a sense, a continuation of Deuteronomy, or at least the story of Deuteronomy. The promise is repeated, the boundaries are broadly defined. Joshua now finds himself in the position of Moses. To some extent, of course, because the role of lawgiver has now been completed, but in other ways, Joshua is to complete what Moses had left undone. This material is not here for Joshua's sake. The charter is written for Israel's sake and ours. Notice the attitude of the 2.5 tribes, faith and obedience, quite different from the attitude Israel often displayed in the past. And also notice how the words of the 2.5 tribes at the end of the chapter exactly echo some of the things that God spoke to Joshua at the beginning of the chapter. This underlines its importance. Chapter 2. Well, it's a great story, but what is the point of this long narrative? Caution is needed with narrative generally, because we're often not told explicitly what the point is. Like here, but indirectly, it establishes that the natives tremble in fear, being aware of the promise and power of Israel's God. Notice why they are afraid. It's because of God, not because of the Israelite armies. And then there's a second point. Rahab is an outsider who nevertheless ends up on the inside because she responds with faith. A little bit of background. What's the significance of Jericho? After crossing the Jordan, the Israelites will have to climb up the steep slopes of the Jordan Valley, and they are high and steep indeed. Jericho is the city guarding the valley and therefore the entrance into the Promised Land. It's a very strategic position. Chapter 3, Crossing the Jordan. Now follows a small repetition of Israel's passage through the Sea of Reeds right after the Exodus. This again establishes Joshua as a second Moses, and like the passing through the sea, it marks the end of an era. The desert wanderings are over. In chapter 4, the first of 7 memorials is set up. It's a double one, each consisting of 12 stones for the 12 tribes, one in the middle of the Jordan, the other at Gilgal, where Israel sets up its base of operations for the first stage of the conquest. Chapter 5, Circumcision. Israel has now entered enemy territory. It is surrounded by enemies. You'd think doing battle would be a priority at this time. Not so. What follows is a mass ritual of circumcision that leaves the army incapacitated. That's not the obvious thing to do, considering the circumstances. By the way, it is surprising that the Israelites born in the desert had not been circumcised. We are not told why, and we are not told that this was wrong, but it comes as a surprise. All of this reinforces the impression that an era has indeed come to an end. In more than one way, they leave the old behind, circumcision. This seals their identity. They then celebrate Passover, and from this point on, there's no more manna. It is only now that the Battle of Jericho begins. Or perhaps everything in the preceding chapters is also part of the Battle of Jericho, getting Israel spiritually aligned with God. At any rate, Joshua has this strange encounter with a man of war who refuses to take sides. Although he is not identified as such, it must be the angel of the Lord, because Joshua calls him Lord and falls down before him. Now it's Joshua's turn to stand on holy ground, much like Moses before him, and in 5 verse 15 he's told to take off the sandals of his feet. In the continuation in chapter 6, the one speaking is God himself. another indication that we are dealing with the angel of the Lord, who is so identified with the Lord himself that the two are at times interchangeable. This part of the book is very familiar. Joshua receives instructions for this peculiar battle, and they lead to a resounding and miraculous victory. In chapter 7, however, one of the Israelites does not maintain the strict separation from everything that pertains to Jericho. We will come back to this issue of devoted things because it requires some special attention and explanation, among other things because it's so strange for us and because of its prevailing presence in the book of Joshua. We'll come back to it. Well, at this point in the story, it's an insider who through disobedience becomes an outsider and suffers the fate of the Canaanites. With immediate consequences, God's wrath is kindled and the battle against Ai, that should have been easy, ends in defeat. In chapter 8, after Achan and his family have been killed, God speaks again to Joshua, repeating the command to not fear. This makes clear that relationship has been restored and Israel is back on track. On the word of the Lord, Joshua resorts to an ambush to take Ai. The end of this chapter describes the ceremony at Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which had been ordered and described in more detail in Deuteronomy 27, where the tribes are divided into two groups, with one blessing the people and the other speaking the curse. In chapter 9, we move to the second stage of the conquest. A beachhead has been established in the center of the country, effectively splitting the Canaanites into two, strategically clever. Some of the kings and cities in the south now mobilize. It's important to realize what Canaan was like at the time. It was thinly populated and most of the population lived in the countryside. And then there were small cities, we would consider them villages, small ones, each being the center of a small kingdom. In light of the battles that take place in chapter 10, we have to conclude that chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, is a significant overstatement. It's hyperbole, that all these kings gathered together as one to fight against Joshua. It is stylistic and formulaic, sort of a fixed formula, which serves as an important hint to tell us about the kind of document or text this is, as we'll see later. So we'll come back to this too. It also serves to bring out, by contrast, how different the Gibeonites respond. Again, outsiders become insiders as the Gibeonites cunningly resort to deception. Notice the editorial comment in 9 verse 14. It says, "But they did not ask counsel from the Lord." At the same time, it's remarkable that God does not confront or complain about this failure to follow the letter of his instructions. There was to be no mercy, no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. But there is no repetition of Ai. I wonder what God was really thinking about the Gibeonites at this point. In chapter 10, the king of Jerusalem recognizes the danger. The Gibeonites are a fifth column, a group of people in their own midst who support their enemies, and this undermines their position, and so he takes the lead. He forms an alliance with four other kings, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, all to the southwest of Jerusalem, and they attack Gibeon. Now, keep in mind, these are the armed forces of 5 small towns. When reading Joshua, we should not envision war on the scale of the 20th century. At this point, remember Deuteronomy and the suzerainty covenant. By making a covenant with the Gibeonites, the Israelites have taken on the role of overlord or suzerain, and the Gibeonites have become their vassals. This explains why the Gibeonites call on the Israelites and why the Israelites are obligated to respond. Joshua resorts to a surprise attack. From Gilgal down in the Jordan Valley, they climb up and march through the night 25 kilometers or more to do battle the following day. After climbing up 1,000 meters and walking quite a march and not sleeping at night. What takes place, what follows, is one of the most spectacular battles in the Old Testament. It's worth pointing out that Joshua does not stop to deal with the kings hiding in the cave. Instead, he maintains momentum, pursuing the warriors to prevent them from entering their cities. He deals with the kings in the evening, turning them into an object lesson for his soldiers. By today's standards, this would be unacceptable, but these were different times. Important to notice is that the call to be strong and courageous is repeated now, but is directed to all the people, not to Joshua. Just as in chapter 8, when the law was read, and therefore it was emphasized that it is for all Israel, not only for Joshua. In the following days, Joshua continues to maintain and exploit the momentum as the Israelites take several cities in the south: Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Hebron, and Debir. Notice that these cities were not necessarily occupied by the Israelites. Hebron had to be conquered again later in the book by Caleb. The Israelites did not settle in any of them at this point. They moved back to the camp, usually Gilgal, but here in chapter 10 for a limited time, a location near Makkedah. In 10 verse 43, when the campaign in the south is completed, they move back to Gilgal. Now, I have skipped a major and controversial issue that we need to talk about, and that is that of the sun standing still in chapter 10. Let's first read it. At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said, in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ayalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. This is not written in the book of Jashar. The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Taken at face value, this sounds as if the sun literally stopped, lengthening the day by at least 12 hours, if not more. Since we know that it's not the sun moving, but the earth turning, this seems to imply that the earth's rotation came to a stop. This, in turn, would have such far-reaching and devastating consequences, such as the water of the oceans continuing their movement and swapping over the continents, that many interpreters have found it difficult to accept such a reading and have looked for alternative explanations. It is, of course, possible to argue if God could stop the earth, he could also stop the oceans and prevent all other devastating consequences of such a sudden stop. And indeed he could, but to many interpreters this sounds out of proportion. A miracle that dwarfs all other miracles except creation, just to give Joshua a bit more time. What alternatives are there? Here are some of the way people have tried to explain what really is behind this text. Some people argue for a solar eclipse. It's not easy to see that in the text, even allowing for alternative translations. An important observation to make is this. There are two geographical locations, Gibeon and Ayalon. Presumably, Gibeon would have been at the back of the Israelites, since they are defending it, therefore in the east, as they face the Canaanites. Ayalon would have been in front of them in the west. This would mean that the sun stood in the east and the moon was in the west. And if the sun and the moon are indeed in opposite positions, an eclipse is out of the question, because it requires the moon to move in front of the sun. Option 2, perhaps due to unusual atmospheric circumstances, some have wondered, light was prolonged after the sun set. This too is not easy to see in the text, although there was indeed unusually heavy hail, so the weather was special. But it's hard to see how this might have added a significant amount of time to the day and not just a little. Then there are those who understand the phrases "the sun stood still" and "stopped" to mean that clouds stopped the sun from shining and beating down on the troops at midday, so that more could be accomplished. Some read the statement as a subjective experience. Because of God's help and intervention, so much was accomplished that the day simply appeared to be much longer than an ordinary day. Now, it is worth pointing out that the crucial statement is a quotation from the book of Joshua, an unknown source, and it is poetry. It means we may be dealing with figurative language and with hyperbole. And then there's one more option, is to think not in terms of length of days, but of omens, special signs, events that were interpreted to mean something in the ancient world. Other ancient battle accounts do refer to such events as well, both miraculous and perhaps not so miraculous, that supposedly proved that the gods were with an army that would embolden them for battle, or that would frighten their enemies. Well, the option sounds interesting and attractive in principle. It gets rather complex, though, trying to make it fit this passage. John Walton and his son tried to do this in their book on the lost world of the conquest of Joshua. They propose that this battle took place at the middle of the month. Presumably the sun stood in the east and the moon was in the west. The moon was going down the moment the sun rose. In other words, it was full moon or close to it. There are texts from the ancient Near East, astrological texts, that suggest that if the full moon happens on the 14th day after the new moon, that was a good omen. When it was a different day, say the 15th day after the new moon, it was a bad omen. Standing and stopping in this context then does not refer to the position of sun and moon in relation to the earth or to the observer, but to each other. Do they wait or stop for each other, or does one hurry ahead of the other? Now, we know that this is entirely predetermined, but the ancients took this as an important sign that indicated favorable or unfavorable circumstances. It's unclear whether Joshua is asking for a good sign for himself or a bad omen for the opponents, who may have been more inclined to pay attention to such things. Either way, in this explanation, Joshua is asking God for a strategic act of assistance from heaven, a sign, and God obliges. Not sure. Rather complicated. And of course, it's always possible that something completely out of the ordinary and miraculous did happen, for which we simply do not have an explanation, also because we don't have more information. In the end, this book is not interested in explaining natural or supernatural occurrences. One thing I do take away from this passage is there are breakthroughs that lead to exceptional days. When they come, let's make full use of them. Since we are on the topic, there is a story that continues to go around about scientists or computers at NASA, the United States Space Agency, discovering through their calculations that there is a day missing. They're greatly puzzled until someone comes up with the suggestion that this may be Joshua's long day. Often it's claimed that there were actually 23 hours and 20 minutes missing, not a full day of 24 hours. This is then explained with the miracle in Isaiah 38, where the sundial moves back 10 steps. The 10 steps are interpreted as 10 degrees out of 360, the number of degrees in a circle. That then is of 24 hours, 40 minutes. Although it seems to me, since the sundial moves back, these were added, not taken away. Anyway, this way, so the story goes, the scientists were able to account for the missing time and wonderfully confirmed the truthfulness of Scripture. Well, it's a classic example of an urban myth. Notice that the story gives no personal names, no source. And how on earth would one determine that a day is missing, let alone 40 minutes? Besides, the story is older than the age of computers and NASA. It can be traced back to 1890, when it first appeared in print. So don't be fooled. If you want the full details on this story, go to a website like bethinking.org. The link's given here for the full story on the story. Okay, chapter 11. The southern campaign has been completed. We now come to stage 3 of the conquest, the campaign in the north. Here, Hazor appears to be the leading city and kingdom and takes the initiative. Again, Joshua manages to stage a surprise attack, and again, the initial victory is followed by the conquest of a number of cities. An interesting statement is made in chapter 11, verse 13. Joshua burned only the city of Hazor, but none of the other ones. A detail that does not sit easily with the wave of destruction that swept over the region in the late 13th century, when most cities were burned down, as shown in archaeology. Interestingly, in Judges 4, we discover that Hazor is still, or yet again, an opponent that needs to be overcome. This is one of many indications that the conquest was not as complete as we may be inclined to think on the basis of certain hyperbolic statements in Joshua. The battle accounts in the first half of the book finish with a summary statement and then a list in chapter 12. Let's read the summary statement at the end of chapter 11. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. Of course, that's what the second half of the book is about. And the land had rest from war. The list that follows, chapter 12, shows all the kings that were defeated in the various battles, and it builds a bridge to the second half of the book, which contains many lists and is concerned with the distribution or allotment of the land that has been conquered in the first half of the book. The second half of Joshua is more difficult for us to read and appreciate. After all, so much of it is simply lists of cities and descriptions of territories and borders. Here we're looking at an overview of chapters 13 down to 22, where we first get an overview of territory not yet conquered, especially in the southwest, the Philistines, and in the north, Lebanon. Then we read about the land distributed to the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan, something that had already taken place, followed by the distribution to the 9.5 tribes. There is remarkable emphasis in chapter 13 and 14 on the fact that Levi does not receive an allotment of land because the offerings of Israel and even God himself are their inheritance. This section, related to the 9.5 tribes, begins with Caleb claiming his inheritance. Chapter 15 describes the allotment for the tribe of Judah, finishing with the note that the Jebusites continued to live at Jerusalem, even though the city had been taken by Joshua. This is yet another indication that the conquest was not as complete as we may think. Chapters 16 and 17 detail the allotment for Ephraim and Manasseh. Here, too, there are Canaanites who continue to live among them. And in this context, the daughters of Zelophehad make an appearance again, also asking for the allotment that had been promised to them. This shows that Joshua does indeed build on what went before, but in this case, it's not Deuteronomy. These women had been given that promise in the book of Numbers. So Joshua builds on Torah, not simply just Deuteronomy. We also get a first taste of something that will be a recurring theme in historical books, the attitude of the Ephraimites. In chapter 17, verse 14 and following, they complain about their allotment. It's not large enough. Chapter 18 begins with setting up the tabernacle in Shiloh, where it would remain until the early monarchy. And it is noticed that 7 tribes still have not received their inheritance. A committee is sent out, and on their return, 7 portions are distributed to the remaining tribes. And this takes us down to the end of chapter 19, where Joshua also receives an inheritance. Notice that this section on the 9.5 tribes begins with Caleb claiming his inheritance and finishes with Joshua receiving his inheritance. These are the 2 sole survivors of those who left Egypt not as little children. They kept the faith in God, and God is faithful and rewards them. And then in 19 verse 51, all of this is summarized as, so they finished dividing the land. In the next 2 chapters, cities of refuge are determined, ordered by Moses in both Numbers and Deuteronomy, and the Levites receive cities to live in and pasture lands for their flocks, ordered by Moses in Numbers. Chapter 21 finishes with another summary statement that notes that God had completely fulfilled his promise. This leaves only one more thing to do. The 2.5 tribes are honorably discharged in chapter 22. Before they cross the Jordan, they build an altar. The other tribes treat this as a transgression of the commandment that there should be only one place of sacrifice, the tabernacle, but it turns out this altar is only to function as yet another memorial in this book, which diffuses a tense situation. By the way, keep this in mind for when you read the final chapters in Judges. A comparable situation, an alleged transgression of a tribe in Israel, turns out quite differently there. If you would like to see a map of the tribal allotments, you can go to a website like studylight.org, to the pastoral resources. There's a biblical map archives there with many good maps, including one of the tribal allotments, showing where the different tribes settled in the land. By the way, we should take note as to how revolutionary this approach was. In Israel, the land was broadly distributed. This meant everyone had access to the means of production and would be able to make a living for themselves. The land was not to be accumulated into the hands of a small group of large-scale landowners. It's a perennial problem in human society that the spread or gap in income and wealth tends to increase. It widens. Israel's answer to this was the year of Jubilee. Every 50th year, land had to be returned to the original owners or their heirs. This way, every generation would have a chance to establish themselves in the land economically. Every Israelite was called upon to be both a productive and a free member of society. It's very different from the way Egypt worked, where everything was owned and controlled by Pharaoh and the priestly class. Not so in Israel. It was designed to be a nation of free landowners. It is one of the ways in which Israel was meant to be different. What comes next in the book, the remaining 2 chapters, takes place, in the words of 23 verse 1, a long time afterwards. The repeated phrase, to be strong and to do all that is in the book of the law of Moses, is repeated once more in 23 verse 6. Let's read that. Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left. But here it is not given to Joshua or to any individual, but to the whole nation. All of them are to live this way. This is linked with the strong demand to not mix with the Canaanites and to stay at a distance from them. Needless to say, this warning would be unnecessary if the Israelites had indeed taken possession of all the land. Nevertheless, Joshua can say this. Chapter 23, verse 14. Not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed. And last, chapter 24. You may recognize certain elements here of the suzerainty covenant. It is a typical covenant renewal ceremony. Joshua reminds the people of the benefits bestowed on them by their overlord. The people recommit to the covenant relationship they are already in. They become their own witnesses, together with yet another stone set up as a memorial. And the book then finishes with the deaths of Joshua and Eleazar. Once when teaching Joshua, I was asked whether Joshua had made a mistake in not appointing a successor the way Moses had done. Well, I hadn't thought of it before, but the answer was immediately clear to me. No, Joshua had not failed. For the time of the Exodus, the desert wanderings, conquest, and land distribution, clear leadership was necessary and was provided by God. But now that Israel had entered the land and settled in it, it was up to them. All of them were to live in relationship with God. This is precisely why the exhortation to be strong and to do all that is written in the law is now directed to the entire nation. All of them were called to follow in the steps of Joshua. And so are we. Like them, we are to be our own Joshuas.